Okay, I think that was really awesome trailer for Silver Nitrate. Hi, everybody. My name is Kali Fajardo-Anstine, and I am the author of the National Book Award finalists Sabrina and Karina and Woman of Light. And I am very excited to be here today with Silvia Moreno Garcia, the award-winning New York Times bestselling author of, you know her books, Velvet Was the Night, Mexican Gothic, many others, including out today in paperback, Silver Nitrate. And before we get into the discussion, I want to read the blurb that I gave Silver Nitrate, because if you haven't read this book, I think you're going to love this book, because I certainly did. I said it was hip as hell. Silver Nitrate delivers a cinematic, exhilarating punch. Silvia Moreno Garcia does it again with this creepy, unforgettable occult thriller teeming with the decadence of old horror movies. It's Mexico City in the 1990s, where beepers, cigarettes, and the ghost of an ex-girlfriend come alive as if leaping from the page. I felt cooler just reading it. Hi, Silvia. It's so nice to see you. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I was wondering if you would kick us off with the reading from the book.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just read very quickly, but I just wanted to show that the paperback actually has interior art.
Oh my God,
Um,
beautiful.
yeah, so that's pretty cool. Nicolas Villiger, who's a Canadian comic book artist that I used for some projects, did this one too. So that's pretty neat.
Oh my God,
Um,
beautiful.
yeah, so I'll read just try to read very quickly, just 2 pages so we can get into this. So it says. An engorged yellow moon painted the sky a sickly amber hue, illuminating a solitary figure. A woman standing between two sycamore trees. It had rained, and the earth was slippery as, breathing with difficulty, she ventured toward the cabin. The woods felt awake and dangerous, with the sounds of crickets and rolling thunder in the distance. There was a thin humming. Was that a bird? It was too high-pitched, that noise. The woman pressed a hand against her lips and stared at the cabin with its welcoming lights. But that oasis of warmth was distant. A twig snapped, and the woman looked behind her in terror. She began to run. The noises of the night were now mixed with the patter of her feet. She flew forward, and her hands desperately pulled at the front door. There was a thump, so loud it sounded like a cannon, until she finally managed to burst into the cabin. She immediately shut the door, bolted it, and stepped back, waiting. Her eyes were wide. The crash of an axe against the wood made the woman jump. Splinters flew. She screamed, pressing back farther into the room as a man hacked his way through the door. The scream was an annoying squeal that made the levels jump into the red. The man lingered at the threshold, clutching the axe. He began advancing. His breath was heavy, punctuated with an annoying pop. Demon possession again? Montserrat asked. Her eyes were on the VU meter. On her knee, she balanced a notepad. Ghosts, Paco said. She scribbled in the notepad. I thought you were into ninjas. We're still doing the ninjas, just not now. A ninja moratorium. The woman screamed again. Montserrat pressed a button. The image froze on the screen. She spun her chair around. The padded room smelled faintly of the pine-scented air freshener that the other sound editors liked to spray around to cover up the fact that they were smoking inside. The whole place was a bit of a mess. The editors regularly left pizza boxes and empty bottles of Pepsi around the mixing room, along with the scent of cigarettes. No food or smoking in the editing room, said a sign half hidden behind the random stickers the editors had pasted on it over the years. In theory, this admonition made sense, especially when you were dealing with film. You didn't want to smear a work print with grease. In practice, though, all editors were supposed to eat in front of the monitors. You were constantly working your ass off in post-production, trying to make up for missed deadlines. Montserrat had never been in a facility that was perfectly neat and organized. Editing rooms all looked like war zones, unless a client was poking their head around. Still, she might have tidied up if Paco hadn't ambushed her. Unfortunately for him, this particular mixing room was small, and unlike the bigger rooms, didn't have a client area with a couch. Paco was sitting uncomfortably on a chair by the door next to a pile of tapes and vinyl records, and from the look of his position, he was probably getting a cramp. So what do you think? Paco asked. I think this is the kind of shit you shouldn't have to be fixing in post-production. Did you shoot those scenes inside a washing machine? The sound is terrible. Those levels are way too hot. I know, but what can you expect with these budgets? And that's
Awesome.
it.
Thank you so much. I love the beginning, especially when there's like the pivot from you when you realize you're not in the horror movie. Like we're actually in a different story when the levels. I love that so much. So to begin, I wanted to talk about when I first read the book, it was still in galleys and I was reading it on my computer. And I actually was reading it at a university engineering building. And the building was like glass and steel and just very bland. And then I kept going back into the world of silver nitrate, which was vivid and lush and filled with detail and description. And I was like, this is why we read books. We read books so we can enter into the other world. So I wanted to ask you, how did this story first come to you? And especially, how did you go about the process of building out the setting and the world for silver nitrate?
Yeah, I wanted to do something that was related to sound engineering, sound technology, because my parents both worked in radio. So I grew up around sound consoles and that kind of world. Radio is a bit different than film, but there were some similarities in the type of kind of lifestyle that you get to see. And then I've always loved cinema, and I worked very briefly in post production, and it was just it's an interesting place. And people don't think about sound very often when they think about movie making. They think about special effects, they think about actors on screen, and sound is kind of forgotten and left behind. But sound is really important, and it can be especially very important for horror films, because if you watch things like Jaws, I think everybody remembers of a certain age that watched Jaws remembers the theme from Jaws, Dana, Dana, na 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 na. And then if you watch Psycho, same thing. If you watch the showers scene, the strings when they come and the shower scene happens, and many other horror scenes take The Exorcist. Actually, the person who did the sound mix for The Exorcist was a Mexican sound editor, very well known in Mexico, and he went to do that mix in over there in Hollywood. And a lot of the kind of things that make it feel eerie in The Exorcist is the kind of sound effects that they're using, the unusual noises that are happening that you can't quite tell what it is. It's probably a celery breaking, things like
Yeah,
that, because that's
yeah.
what uh, people who do sound effects use. But I just kind of like the fact that it's a bit of a hidden art, sound.
Yeah. And that reminds me, like, I'd have like a bad babysitter as a kid who'd let me watch Child's Play or something, and I would cover my ears instead of my eyes because that way I wouldn't get so afraid. Um, but I want to talk to you about your relationship to film. So I recently was at the Library of Congress, and I saw you were too recently. And I got to tour the vaults where they keep all the silver nitrate films. And I kept thinking about your novel over and over again. Like we couldn't even bring our cell phones in case they blow up, and then everything blows up. So I would love to hear about your relationship to film in general, but also like specifically this kind of film, silver nitrate.
Yeah, I've always been a big film buff, so I watched movies since I was very, very young, and horror movies in particular. I remember going to see Aliens. I was probably 4 years old, I think, when that came out, and we went to see Aliens. No, my parents were not bad. There's a long story behind that. But I always kind of fell in love with film in general, with horror as one of the particular genres, and just grew up watching that and living through that in a world that was different from streaming. And that's one of the things that I wanted to capture with Silver Nitrate. Um, Finding films was a process of discovery and adventure. Things were not always at your fingertips, so you had to hunt down for movies in certain ways. One way was if there was a film festival, for example, that was doing a retrospective on Luis Buñuel or whatever, you would show up for all the days that they would be doing that. If the Cineteca was showing something, so they had several cycles of cinema, you would go and watch those, but also video stores and places like La Lagunilla, places where you would trade material and find material. And there was an element of socializing and of oral knowledge that is kind of almost basically lost in the days of streaming, because you would go to the, or I would go to the video store, and there was always this slightly kind of older guy, but not that old, somebody in their 20s with long
Yeah.
hair who would always be hanging out near the register because I guess they were friends with somebody that worked there. And
Yeah.
he would always have this vast film knowledge. So, he would go to the counter and he would be like, "Hey, kid, have you watched, I
Yeah.
see that you have such and such, but have you watched this other thing?" And you would be like, "No." And he would be like, you totally should." And it was
Yeah.
just really fun. Uh, and so film wasn't just about what the stuff that you caught on screen. It was also about the process of hunting it down. There were many movies that I couldn't see, but I could read film capsules, film reviews, history books about it. And it was only years later that I was able to see kind of the whole thing. So it was not that easy sometimes to find certain bits of cinema. And so that was kind of like an interesting journey. And oddly enough, now with streaming, we have everything at our fingertips and nothing at the same time, because one of the bizarre things that has happened is that I think 90% of all films on Netflix have been made in the last 15 years, 10 years, something like that. So the whole of experience that most people are kind of consuming, watching, is very recent. And there's like more than 100 years of cinema that they don't know exists. And so in a way, it was harder to hunt when I was young and I was looking for movies and going to places like Tower Records and video stores and cinema retrospectives. But in another way, it was easier at the
Yeah.
same time because not everything was recent, not everything was mainstream. And so I got to see a lot of really weird stuff and got a hold of a lot of stuff in ways that are just not common
Yeah.
nowadays. So
Yeah. Oh, I mean, you brought back so many memories for me. Like I remember going to the Blockbuster near my parents' house and one time seeing our priest like over in the horror movie section. And I was like, priest watch bad scary movies and like just like that whole community. Which brings me to my next question. So I actually got my start in the publishing world as a bookseller. I worked at a used antiquarian rare bookshop in Denver for about 10 years, called West Side Books. And so I think I was like that version of the video store person, but as like a teenage bookstore girl. And one of the things that I found out being a bookseller is that genre has been incredibly important to my life. And genre is incredibly important to my readers and my community. So I remember like we would have these obscure like space westerns, and somebody would come in and they'd buy a whole stack of 30 of the paperbacks. So I wanted to talk to you as a writer who explores genre. First of all, what does the paperback like mean to you as a writer? Like, what's your relationship like to the paperback as a form, as a technology? But also, like, just could you talk about the genres included in Silver Nitrate? And if you want to bring that to your other books, go ahead. But like, I want to talk about Silver Nitrate. It's so cool. I hope that
uh,
question makes sense.
yeah, no, I mean, paperbacks are a relatively recent invention. The paperback is made in the 1950s, more or less, right after. During World War II, they make a program to send cheap books overseas, and the paperback kind of originates there, the idea of mass market readership. Before that, it's not really, books are very expensive during the Depression, even after. And changes in technology allow publishers to make paperbacks and then to decide that they are going to sell them to everybody. It's going to be like, Penguin Classics, accessible to everybody, that kind of stuff. And genres really flourished with paperbacks because before that, you don't have a division of categories. Before the 1950s, if you look at the history of books in the United States, it's all fiction. It's just one big compartment. But in the 1950s, you get science fiction, you start getting mysteries, thrillers, romances, all these kinds of genres. They emerge from, they're paralleling the developments in magazines. Magazines do have genres. You have magazines like Amazing, which are sci-fi. You have Western magazines, you have romance magazines, you have detective story magazines. But that's not translating into books until the 1950s. And in the 1950s, book publishers, especially those that have ties to magazines like Dell and Abyss that were running magazines at the same time, are trying to duplicate what they're seeing in magazines, or seeing that people buy romances, or seeing that people buy Westerns. by making categories in books and starting to sell a Western, a romance, things like that. And the technology of the paperback is what allows that to be profitable, because it's a lot cheaper to print a paperback than it is to print a hardcover. So it's really, genre and paperback are very much tied together. And then what happens is that there's further technological advances and marketing advances, and you start seeing paperbacks at the supermarket kind of situation. Romance really gets a boost from that. You know, women are going to the checkout area and there's romances there, that sort of thing. And then we get a scaling back in as the years go by eventually. And nowadays, for example, the mass market paperback, the pocket paperback, which was a very small one, you don't see that anymore, basically, just as much. You get a lot of thick, chunky books being favored by people, where people start to kind of think that a book is worth by the pound, so they don't want very thin books. But there's a time period in which you have things like ace doubles, and these are very, you know, they're not that big, and there's two novellas in one, you flip it around, you see it like that. Romance novels were, you know, were very thin. All those harlequins were not quite that big. So they kind of parallel each other. Some of the stuff that happens in paperback really affects what's being produced in genre, and vice versa. What's being produced in a kind of category affects the format. So it is interesting when you go to used bookstores that sometimes you find some formats that are kind of almost gone now, almost diseased in the outside world.
Yeah, I love that you brought up the armed service editions, because I actually have one like sitting right off the counter. Because that's how like Great Gatsby had its second life, was the soldiers were reading it and sharing it. But I'm so excited for Silver Nitrate to be in paperback. And I know whenever my books go into paperback, that's when like the people can get it and they can carry it in their pockets and put it in their backpacks. So very excited it's out in the world today. Well, I have one last question for you, and then I'm going to switch over to the audience questions, because I know we have a lot from the audience. Your books are filled with research. And as a fellow researcher, I am always in admiration of you when I learn something new, when I learn about all of the silver nitrate hidden beneath a hockey rink, that kind of fact. Those things really stand out for me. And I'm wondering if you can talk about your research process, which I'm sure is different for each book, or maybe it's not. But how do you go about starting a plan for research?
Yeah, it varies by the book, but generally it's secondary sources, a lot of material that has been written about a time period. People, you know, not so much primary sources. Silver Nitrate that did have primary sources, because I ended up interviewing several editors, sound editors and editors. A friend of mine who I worked with at one point sat down and chatted with me, and then a friend of his chatted with me, and stuff like that, where I was kind of going back to people and just talking about the business of editing. But I also was reading a lot about film preservation and things like that. And what else was done? There was a book that was produced a number of years ago where they interviewed people who had worked during the golden age of cinema in Mexico.
Okay.
And it had first person interviews. So I read some of that. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that brings me to our first audience question from Josephine. Mexican films from the Golden Age were a big part of my life growing up, and it warmed my heart seeing them represented in this novel. Were there films that inspired you to write this story? Which is your favorite?
Yeah, there were several filmmakers that I was thinking about. I have a soft spot for Carlos Enrique Taboada, who I kind of took inspiration from Mexican Gothic, but who was also a filmmaker that was active for a long time. Films like Alucarda from Moctezuma were very interesting, and Bloody Mary also from him, because Alucarda is an English language film with a Mexican cast in Mexico, and it's kind of a semi-adaptation of Carmilla at the same time. So it's kind of a special film because of that. I think there is I mean, and it was done in English for a reason. It was because they needed funding, and you couldn't make a lot of things in Mexico at the time. The industry was kind of was in a slump, in a terrible slump.
Okay.
1970s, 1980s are, and the early 1990s are terrible times for Mexican cinema. It's not until the early 1980s that you start getting what is called a Nuevo Cine Mexicano, New Mexican Cinema. And you have filmmakers that we know nowadays, like Guillermo del Toro, emerging. But it's a terrible time period for movies for a long time. But there's people like Moctezuma who are still making films, and some of them are making horror films. And so he gets this idea to do this English language film, and shoots it in Mexico. And it's a bizarre movie because of that, because you've got these actors kind of speaking in another language and all that. But it's also because it's a thing that is dislocated in time. It does not it kind of takes place in when I don't know, where I don't kind of know sort of situation. And because we have these ideas of what is Mexican and what isn't, what represents Mexicanidad and what is not. And absolutely, Alucarda does not look at all, and neither do the pictures of Tabuada look like what people expect Mexico to look. There's a certain aesthetic that people kind of demand of Mexican things, the big hats, the Speedy Gonzalez kind of situation, certain locations. And movies like Poison for the Fairies from Tabuada, which is kind of takes place at an estate, but like a countryside estate, or Alucarda, don't conform to those notions of what it means to be like a Mexican horror movie. El Santo doesn't show up and battle people. There's no, and so there's not these markers that we kind of associate with Mexicanness in these movies. And yet at the same time, these are undoubtedly Mexican filmmakers kind of doing their own thing. So I like them for that reason, in part because they make you think about what is like when you talk about national cinema, what is national cinema? What does it mean to have, like Italian cinema or American cinema or Mexican cinema? Does it always, have the same form, the same shape? And it doesn't. And so Alucarda is interesting for that reason. And the director was is kind of interesting too, because his last film and the last film of Carlos Enrique Taboada were both lost. Both are lost films, like and I won't go into that, but two of the major horror film directors that we had in Mexico both had lost films that we cannot find in their stories behind them both. So,
well, are they lost, or I'm like, let's okay. That it's sort of interesting. Like, it reminds me of my first reading I ever did for Sabrina and Karina, like somewhere else, like not in Denver. And somebody said, "How is this a book about Chicanas?" And I said, "Because I'm a Chicana and I wrote it." But I could tell they were like, this doesn't fit the standard that we want. Okay, so this next question is from Gabriela, and it's about your characters. So all your main characters have been very distinct in personality, in hobbies, in careers, and you've written so many stories at this point. So what do you do to ensure your characters are all so unique?
Well, I meet interesting people in my life. That's one of the tricks, and then you will never run out of interesting characters, I hope. But specifically here in this character, Momo and Tristan, I was thinking a lot about some of the sound work that my mother did in radio when she was a really good editor. Her job was to be a radio announcer, but she knew how to edit tape. Back in the day, everybody kind of had to. And my father, who worked with her as a radio producer, and they would work together, they would call her over, the male technicians and my dad. It was all male. It was no women, basically, except for the announcers. And so they would call her, my dad would call her over when he needed to do an important splice, because he wasn't so good at doing the actual cutting and the splicing, and his ear was not as good as my mother's ear.
Wow.
So my mother's ear was really good. So he would call her over. She would do the actual, listening and cutting and putting back together again of the tape, that kind of editing part. and then it would run through, and everybody would congratulate my dad.
Oh, that's
uh,
horrible.
and on his wonderful work. So my mother never forgot that. She told me that story about what it felt like, um, to basically do this kind of work, and nobody ever kind of
Yeah.
recognizing you. My mother was the first female radio announcer at the radio station for the University of Baja California, the UABC. And they did a retrospective at one point a few years ago, the UABC, about the early days of the university and that kind of stuff. And they looked at the radio station, and my dad had also worked there.
Okay.
And so they contacted him to interview him for some of the stuff that they were doing. They did not talk to my mother.
Oh my gosh.
So she was the first on the radio in that state, in Baja California. Before her, there had been no female announcer on the radio, basically at the National University there. But they didn't talk to her. They forgot to talk to her. They forgot that she existed, which
Yeah.
was kind of interesting. So part of that went into making Momo, the character of Montserrat. Those experiences in radio, and what radio meant for my mother, and sound, and yet she was not recognized for her work.
Yeah.
And then Tristan, partially inspired by several people, one of them my husband, who had a very bad accident at one point, and then and a friend of mine who was a child actor when we were growing up, and he used to do Suavitel commercials
Okay.
back in the day, and how his life turned out eventually, which was not good for a very long time.
Okay. Very interesting. I mean, that's so moving, the backstory, especially about your mom and giving her, I mean, how did she respond to the book? Did she
Oh,
like
yeah, she enjoyed it because of all the sound stuff, right? So
Okay, I'm
she
glad.
liked it.
Yeah, I'm so glad. So we have another question that's sort of just about the logistics, because you're one of the most prolific writers we have. Thank you, Silvia. And this question is from Aniko. How long does it usually take for you to write a book?
It depends on the research. If it's something that I know about and I'm very familiar with, and I can just do very little research, it's very fast. If it's something that I have to kind of go into, and I know less about the subject matter, then it's going to take probably a lot longer. And also, if real life interferes with things, I've been sick, I've been not well for many months right now, and I've written very little this year. So I'm kind of trying to get back into it, but I don't know what will happen. But normally I'm fairly fast once I have the whole research portion done. But the whole research portion is, can take months and months of work, depending on what I'm talking about and if it's easy to get stuff. And sometimes I can't get materials so easily in Canada, so I have to get them from the University of Riverside in California through interlibrary loan, and
Yeah.
it's like 2 weeks, that kind of stuff. So yeah.
And then when do you write while you're researching, or do you mostly just do a research portion of the novel and then you start writing?
All the research comes first. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'm always fascinated by that, because I have a really hard time jumping between just binging research and then writing. I usually wait. Okay, so we have Fabiola has a question about genre for you. How are you able to jump from genre to genre, and are the processes any different between each book?
I had a very eclectic omnivorous diet when I was growing up, so I think I didn't quite see the dichotomies between genres so clearly as later on, when I started kind of working in this field and writing more in this field, I did learn about it and how there's some very sharp divisions between certain categories. But just growing, like my formation was very eclectic, and I think because of that reason, I like to move around genres. And the writers that I have admired the most, like Joyce Carol Oates, have that capacity to switch between formats or between genres, that kind of stuff. So for me, that was kind of like the marker of a great writer, was that, like they can do all kinds of things. And whether that's flawed or not, it's just like what I thought as I was kind of reading my way through. And so I have a desire to kind of like be like Joyce Carol Oates, be like
Yeah.
all these writers that I read when I was younger.
Yeah. I recently read H.G. Wells for the first time. I read The Invisible Man and I was like, I was so hooked. I had to stay up really late and finish it. And I was like, I have to read all of his books now. And it did remind me of your books in a way. And it made me think that I also was raised and nurtured by genre. And I didn't think about it as something that was separate until the publishing industry told me and the bookstore told me I had to put things in certain areas. So this is a question from Melissa, and it has to do with the eras. So your books are set in different time periods. How do you select those eras, and how do they come to you?
Uh, at one point, I had a very silly notion of writing a book set in every decade of the 20th century in Mexico, and I haven't quite stuck to that because I figured out that that was maybe too much and perhaps a little too restrictive. But I did have like an idea of a project at one point for that. I just kind of jump around things, places that sort of interest me and go into them. So I had a really great interest in doing something related to a Western, and I want really to do it at one point. So that'll probably take me a little bit further back in time that I normally go, not the 20th century, perhaps the kind of late 1800s maybe. And that'll be, because of the form of the Western, if I do it like that. But yeah, it's just like the time period that seems interesting at the time sometimes helps determine what you're going to do with it. But I'm not proceeding with my every decade of the 20th century project. I have done several decades by now. I think I've done the 20s, and I've done the 50s and 60s, 70s, and the 90s with this one, 80s too. So I'm missing a few decades, but I don't think I'm going to hit myself over the head if I don't do like the 1940s, or I don't do the Cristero Rebellion or something like that. But at one point I was like, yeah, I'm going to do all of these, and it's going to be
Yeah.
like one by one. And then I was like, where is it going to stop? Then am I going to go and do like, the 1800s and decade
Yeah.
by decade? So I thought it's too crazy making, but I like challenges like that. So at some
Mhm.
points I have made challenges for myself of like, I have to try to write, you know, um, like a quest story that was Gotha, Jade, and Shadow, a quest narrative, because I don't like quest narratives normally, but I wanted to do the hero's journey from the point of a heroine. So I was kind of like, can I do a hero's journey kind of story, but do it in another way that I find interesting? And so that was kind of like my own mini challenge. The Western is meant to be my own mini challenge. And I set myself challenges like that all the time. So it's just, I don't know. I like to, I guess, be constantly fighting against myself.
Well, as somebody who kind of wrote a Western, my advice is to put more horses than you think you need,
Oh,
because
okay.
some of my Goodreads reviews were like, where are the horses? There's not enough horses. But yeah, I did realize I was like, genre writers or readers really they have like these things that you're supposed to hit every time, and more
All
horses.
right. Horses. Yeah, the better. Okay.
So there's several questions here about advice for aspiring writers, advice for writers who work in the horror genre. And I'm going to kind of merge some of these questions because some of them are also about like, what do you do when you get writer's block, which I kind of think is part of the same questioning. So yeah, this is a question from Paola. Do you have advice for young aspiring writers?
Yeah, read a lot. Actually, one of the only times that you will get a chance to read a lot is before you become kind of like a working writer.
Yeah.
Because if you become a full-time freelance writer, like I am right now, where I make all of my income from several writing activities,
Yeah.
it will eat up a lot of your reading time. You will be reading, but you will be blurbing, for example, and that's kind of homework. I mean, it can be fun, but it is homework. It's not like, you went and you picked it out from the outside world. It came to you, the book. Or you might be reviewing a book, and again, in that case, you might be assigned a book. Or if you're a teacher, you might be teaching a book, so you have to read the book in order to teach it, that kind of situation. And so that kind of reading for pleasure and exploring really kind of goes away later on in life. You have less chances to kind of just, you know, play around with your time and your reading lists. And so I say, you know, when you're young and you're starting out and there's no boundaries and you're not, you know, worried about deadlines and things like that, that you will be ready about later on. Yeah, just like really read a lot and write a lot of stuff that is not probably, you know, a lot of it is not going to be published, maybe because you're just learning how to write, but it's your chance to basically do a lot of mistakes and and experience a lot of the literary world. And it's like how apprentices work, you know. Da Vinci had apprentices, they would copy him, they would they would, you know, draw pictures of like the masters, and that's how you would learn. And that's just part of the process. If you don't do that, then, you know, it's like you're missing out on a lot of learning activities. And it is a time to do that. I never went to a workshop. I never did, you know, kind of like writers retreats. They're so expensive. I didn't do an MFA, anything like that. But what I did was I read a lot, you
Yeah.
know, used bookstores, libraries, just trading books with friends, all that kind of stuff. And so I got a really rich education out of that. So you don't necessarily need to get an MFA to do that. If you know,
Yeah.
go and just do the readings, you will learn what's going on with these books.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Like, because of my book selling background and being a huge reader, there's just so many more books I know about than what when I came to my MFA, like people didn't know Dashiell Hammett, just like
Yeah.
very basic things. So I think it's so interesting. Also, the idea that the pleasure reading will go away when you become a freelance writer.
Mhm.
Um, I know that. So there was times like right after my last book came out, I didn't even want to go into a bookstore because I didn't want to see which books were on display that weren't
Yeah.
mine. Because I was like, what about my book? But I was like, wait a second. I love the bookstore. The bookstore is my happy place. So it does change your relationship, I think. That's a really interesting response. Okay, so this is a question from John. He would like to know, after reading Silver Nitrate, which one of your books do you recommend next?
Oh, so I've got The Seventh Veil of Salome this year, which is out in August. It's not genre, it's not horror, it's historical without any like fantastical elements, but it also has to do with film. So if you like film, you might want to, you know, pre-order or get or ask your library to order The Seventh Veil of Salome ahead of hand. And if you just like, I guess if you like horror novels, I would say the one that is maybe comparable in an urban setting is actually Certain Dark Things. It's more like of an urban fantasy. There's vampires in Mexico City, but it is Mexico City, kind of like a alternate Mexico City. I mean, people know me for Mexican Gothic, but that's kind of like a Gothic novel. So if you don't like Gothic spaces, big houses, distant locations, women in danger kind of situation, Mexican Gothic is not for you. If what you appreciated of Silver Nitrate is kind of like the urban environment, the fact that they are in Mexico City, that there's like modern shit happening and that kind of stuff, and some kind of supernatural or unnatural element, I think Certain Dark Things is like a little bit kind of neo-punk bits of urban fantasy sort of situation that might fit a little bit better. Although if people like haunted houses, you know, go to town on Mexican Gothic. It has a lot of haunted houses.
Awesome. So this is a question from Anna. What authors inspire you most? And you already mentioned Joyce Carol Oates, but take it away, Silvia.
Yeah, I think I had a really long relationship with Lovecraft, and some people know me from my early days in the Lovecraftian circle. So I spent a lot of time thinking about H.P. Lovecraft. I wrote a thesis on him,
Yeah.
um, on eugenics and H.P. Lovecraft for my degree in science and technology studies, not literature. And and so I spent a lot of time considering Lovecraft, but it kind of depends on the book. Like Lovecraft has definitely been pivotal for horror. Poe has been pivotal for horror. Horacio Quiroga was a major force when I was working on Mexican Gothic. But for other works, it has been different stuff, because I did read Dashiell Hammett, for example, and he's like kind of huge. If you're doing anything that's noir, crime, that kind of stuff, you kind of like go back to Dashiell Hammett, read it, and go on. So it really depends on the kind of of work that you're looking at. And I mean, there's just some people like Joyce Carol Oates that just fascinate me because of their capacity to do things that are so wildly different, or Tanny Lee, or some other writers like that, where you take one work of them and then you read another work and you are just astounded by how different um, it is. I think somebody that also did that to me in a way was, when I read, oh, I just forgot the name. He died recently, and Blood Meridian. You know,
Yeah.
when I read Blood Meridian, and I had read All the Pretty Horses,
Yeah. It's
and
a
I
different.
thought it was okay.
Yeah.
I was like, it's okay, right? I get what you're
Yeah.
doing. It's kind of Shakespearean sort of situation, blah blah blah, and it's in the American landscape and all this kind of thing. And then I read Blood Meridian, and I was like, like, how could the same guy like
Yeah.
do both kinds
Yeah.
of things at the same time? And Blood Meridian was just like a visceral experience. So, and some
Yeah.
people say it's too hard, the words are kind of weird and all that kind of stuff. But I remember just being fascinated by how lush everything felt on the page. The book felt squishy, like it had blood inside of it,
Oh my
like
God.
it was alive. It was alive in a way. And it really is a horror story at the same time. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not horror in the traditional sense of the categories, and like we said, it's not
Yeah.
Sheldon horror, but it really feels at one point like a horror novel. Like you started reading what you thought was a Western, like
Yeah.
you got a Western, and then you get to the middle of it and you're like, oh my God, this is like Stephen King kind of
This
shit,
is
right?
fascinating. We
Yeah.
need to have another Zoom where we just talk about the horror in Blood Meridian.
Yeah.
Um, when I gave it to my dad to read for the first time, he like read it and he like looked like stunned when he finished, and he was like, "That's an ugly book." It's like all
It
he
is
had
an
to
ugly
say.
book. It
Yeah,
is,
and I was
yeah.
just like, but he is, yeah, he's one of those writers. I totally agree, where it's like, this is the same person, this is the same mind. And I don't know, I kind of feel a little pressure from the industry to like, if you've already had something that worked, just keep doing what works. And
Yeah.
like, I think there was a lot of surprise when I was like, my next one will be sci-fi. And they're like, no, what? Do the thing that works. But I really appreciate that about you. It's just like, first of all, you're very open about industry things. Occasionally I see your tweets or something and I learn something from you. But also your willingness to just pivot and change, I think it's an example for us all. And you really, I think that helps all of us writers when you do that. So thank you, Sylvia. Um, this is a really interesting question from Lynette, and I've never seen a question like this before. So I was like, ooh, this must be over in the genre audience. I want these kinds of questions. So if you could write at any point in history, like go back in time, what point in history would you write from and why?
If I could time travel
Yeah,
to
if you could time
somewhere.
travel and write in that time period.
Oh, and work in that time period. That's very
Yeah.
dangerous actually for somebody who looks like me, right? I mean, you
I'm
don't want to
like, where
be in
would you
certain
go?
time. Yeah, you don't want to be in certain time periods. I mean, I have a fascination with the Tudor era that I've had for a really long time. I have a lot of books about Tudor England, Henry VIII and Elizabeth in that time period. I mean, it's one of those places where you kind of want to be there because it's the whole Protestant Catholic clash and things are happening that are going to mold the European states into what we know as modern Europe.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it's like, and Shakespeare's around and all that kind of stuff. Marlowe disappeared. So there's a lot of like chunky good stuff. They're going to find the quote unquote new world sort of thing. The colonization is going to begin to happen.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like interesting stuff that is kind of happening around that you know rough period of Tudor England. But on the other hand, it's like there's also like smallpox is
Yeah.
a real thing, and there's no vaccine against it. So I don't know about traveling
There's no
too
electricity.
far back in time. There's no electricity. Europeans don't really wash themselves
Yeah,
a
the smell's
lot.
really bad everywhere.
Yeah, there's a lot of horses that poop in the streets. So yeah, so I mean, maybe for like a brief, like limited time period, if I was safe, I would go to Tudor England and just
Yeah. Like
see
a
what's
writer's
going on.
residency in Tudor
Yeah,
England.
writer's
Yeah.
residence in Tudor England. Just make sure you don't piss off Henry VIII kind of
Yeah.
situation.
I love it. No, I love that. I'm gonna start asking that question. This would be like my general question. So if you could go back in time. Okay, so I think we have time for one more question from, well, maybe two, but maybe just one. This is about the playlist that you make for your books, and this is from Colleen. Colleen says, I enjoy the playlist that you make for your books. How do you choose the songs, and do they fit with the specific scenes in the books?
Yeah, they're often stuff that I was listening to while I was writing, and then I curate it and add some more stuff, take away some things. So they often have to do with the mood of the book that I'm working on. So Silver Nitrate has a lot of 1990s and electro pop sort of stuff in there because I think it fits the vibe. And I did a playlist for The Seventh Veil of Salome, which will be out in August, and that's almost all jazz standards, both
Oh, really?
original jazz, yeah, from the era, and some jazz covers, but it's all basically like, yeah, jazz because they're in
Is,
1955.
is this on Spotify that I can find the playlists?
I made it, but I don't think they've shared it. I don't think the publisher
Okay.
has shared it yet. I'm sure they will at some point. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you send it like 7 months ahead, and then then at some
okay.
point they put it out into the world. Yeah.
I would love to. I would love to see the Silver Nitrate playlist because I was like, you were like referencing just bands and things I forgot about, and like Motorhead was in there, and I was like, ah,
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
would love to see
yeah.
that. So I will go find that. Okay, I think we do have the final question. What sources of pop culture have been your biggest influence or motivation? This is from Celia.
Movies, movies. Yeah,
Okay.
for sure. I'm not a. I don't really watch TV, which my husband says never tell anybody that they're gonna think you're a snob. But I don't watch TV um because I use most of my free time to read and to write and to watch movies. So I
Yeah.
watch a lot of the Criterion channel, not a lot of TV. So a lot of it is film, some of it is music. Like The Seventh Veil of Salome has a lot of. I was thinking a lot about opera actually when writing that, which is not pop culture, at least of this time period. But
When you're
it's
going
it's
back in
like
time, yes.
going back in time, of course, in the time of Mozart, it's totally pop culture.
Yeah.
But like cultural influences, and so yeah, definitely film is one of the huge ones that is not books, like, yeah, film, not really video games, not really like TV, not even really social media because I'm not on there much anymore,
Yeah.
which I'm glad. People tell me such and such thing is happening on TikTok or Twitch or whatever the hell, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't know, and I am so
Yeah.
happy. Like,
Yeah.
such a good day without knowing what you're talking about. Yeah.
I have no idea what's going on Twitter or TikTok, but if you are on TikTok, please talk about me on there.
Yes.
I would love that. But yeah, I think movies, I'm always interested too when I read a book written before film that still has like a cinematic quality to it. And so I kind of wonder if our minds are just very imagist. But Sylvia, it's been a pleasure. I think we've had some overlap on festivals, but we've never have gotten to meet in person, and we still have not. And I hope I hope we get to someday. But it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. I want to thank everybody who's been here with us, who joined us for this midday mystery from Barnes and Noble. If you bought a signed book plate ticketed book today, it'll be there and it be with you in about 8 to 10 business days. Do you see that I'm doing the script? I'm doing my job. But of course, you can also order Silver Nitrate 24/7 at barnesandnoble.com. Sylvia, it was wonderful talking to you. I hope our paths cross again in the future.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day. Thanks for stopping by.
Awesome. Bye, everybody.
Bye.